Chapter 12. Dre. If it looks, smells, and sounds like a dungeon. Dre woke up and nearly panicked at his unfamiliar and ominous surroundings. It took a few racing heartbeats before his memories returned in a rush, and he let out a sigh of relief. He felt quite refreshed, which was surprising, since by the location of the sun in the sky, his nap hadn't lasted all that long. He stretched his arms above his head in a yawn, but he couldn't help but notice his bicep nearly bulging out of his sleeve as he brought his arms back down. Now that he was thinking about it, he felt strong. Very strong. He stood up from where he had leaned his back against his pack, which in turn had leaned against a tree that he had managed to find without green ooze leaking from it. He picked up the pack and marveled at how much lighter it felt to him. He put it on his back and began to move around in odd ways, testing the limits of his balance. It was simply incredible. Previously, the pack had felt cumbersome, like all the weight was dragging down at the very bottom of the pack, beneath his butt. It had strained his shoulders, and the strap around his waist had dug into his skin and left it red and raw. Now, though, the weight felt concentrated near the center of his back, beneath his shoulder blades. The pack felt more part of him than something he was carrying. He found himself naturally adjusting his movements to account for the pack, as if he had been born with such weight resting on his shoulders. Well, that didn't take long. Dre jumped at the voice, but then turned and grinned as Adian approached. How long was I out? Adian shrugged. Well, Gavin has only managed to eat his way through 2 full days of rations, so it can't have been that long. But what really matters is if you were able to acquire any new skills. He smiled, the light of anticipation evident in his gaze. Dre's grin widened, and he almost didn't believe the words even as he said them. I leveled up 4 times. 4. Adian's eyebrows crawled up his forehead. Really? Did any new skills become available? Dre nodded. I chose 4 new skills, 1 per level, which is way more than you said I'd get. Adian's jaw dropped. Unbelievable, he said. What did you choose? Dre hesitated, but then smiled and flexed his now bulging bicep. Increased strength, reduced weight, encumbered balance, and quick retrieve. Well, with how you were just moving around, it would seem that your mobility while wearing that pack has dramatically improved, which is what we were hoping for. Have you tested out quick retrieve yet? Adian questioned. We're going to have to figure that out together. I was hoping that this time I might be provided more information about the new skills, but it looks like that just isn't how my class works. So it's trial and error for me, I guess. So saying, Dre took off his pack, set it on the ground, and reached his hand into it without a moment of hesitation. A moment later, he screamed and desperately pulled his hand back. He barely registered the shouts of surprise from beside him as he stared in relief at his undamaged hand. When he had reached into the bag, his hand had simply disappeared into an opening that now looked as if it was filled with mist and darkness. It hadn't hurt, it just felt like a strong tingling sensation. It was the disappearance of his hand that had really freaked him out. He turned and smiled sheepishly at the startled faces of Adian, Gavin, Marcia, and Miena, and, what was the archer's name? Dre racked his brain for a few moments before he blurted out, Olive. Yes? Olive replied, questioningly. Dre said. He could feel himself blush as he tried to think of some reason he could make up for shouting out the man's name like that. Could I borrow an arrow? The man hesitated, but only for a moment, before he pulled an arrow out of the quiver strapped to his back. He flipped it up into the air, deftly caught it by the flat sides of the broad point, and handed it, fletching first to Dre. Dre looked at the deadly projectile for a heartbeat, then shrugged and dropped it into the strange, dark, and misty opening of his pack. As he stared at it, he realized that the opening reminded him of that nowhere place, inhabited by the cloaked figure where he had chosen his class. Dre was pulled from his thoughts by the nearly forceful stares of Olive, Adian, and the others, who had stopped their preparations to see what Dre was doing. He hesitated a moment, before he pushed his hand through the opening. There was no resistance, but he once again felt a strong tingling. What now, though? Previously, he would think of an item and it would appear within the main compartment of the bag. Then he would have to reach all the way into the bag, find a way to grab it, and then pull it out. Similar to any other pack, except the compartment only ever held the singular item that he was thinking of. So, he thought of the arrow that he had just dropped in, and then he closed his fist as if to grasp it, and sure enough, he felt the wooden arrow shaft clutched in his closed hand. Dre grinned fiercely, pulled the arrow out, and handed it back to Olive. The archer thanked him distractedly while he stared at the pack. Eventually he said, "I wish I had a quiver like that. My arrow conjuration skills are even quicker, but they are extremely aether-intensive, so I don't use them except in the most dire of scenarios. In an ordinary battle, I must spend half my combat time fumbling around for arrows." Dre had a hard time imagining the poised man fumbling with anything, ever, but the others all laughed at what was apparently a joke. He smiled half-heartedly, but then reached back into his bag and pulled out the hilt of a longsword. He continued pulling until a small amount of the blade was bared, but then slowly turned the hilt until it was almost perpendicular to the ground. His smile turned genuine when he saw that the sword wasn't poking out of the side of the pack like it should have been. He turned the hilt this way and that, but nothing happened. It was as if the rest of the sword simply didn't exist. He returned the sword fully to his pack, then pulled the pack onto his shoulders. He looked around at Adian and the members of his old team and asked, "Are you ready?" Before anyone had a chance to answer, Dre began a string of furious motion. He reached back with his right hand, pulled out a canteen, and threw it towards Gavin. With his left hand, he retrieved a large cloak and threw it at Marcia. He grabbed a sheathed dagger and tossed it to Miena while simultaneously throwing a bundle of arrows to Olive. Dre then reached into the pack with both hands and pulled out Adian's guitar. He smirked into the stunned silence as he handed it to the field musician. He had managed to supply all of them with one of their items in only a few heartbeats. Before anyone had a chance to respond, a long-suffering voice came from behind him. "Well, it looks like waiting for you to take a little catnap wasn't a total waste of time." Dre turned and then took a startled step back when he realized how close the captain's sneering face was. Dre didn't understand it, but it somehow felt as though he was looking up at Rucker, even though he stood a full head taller than the man. After long moments, the captain turned his ugly expression away from Dre and raised his voice. "All right, now that our one-boy caravan is all rested up, come collect any gear that you need and prepare to enter the dungeon." His last words were liberally coated with sarcasm, and he said it with his eyes locked on Adian. Dre wasn't sure if the captain was using a skill, or if he was just being cowardly, but even though he wanted to feel angry, he just felt cowed. All those who weren't guarding the ominously dark and motionless cave mouth rushed over to Dre to get the miscellaneous supplies that they would need. The only thing that all of them retrieved was a little vial of angry red liquid that they all downed like a shot of hard liquor, with the only exception being Adian's group. Before long, a few men had replaced the cave guards, and Dre had doled out the final supplies. With his only task complete, he walked towards Adian. He passed militia members that were suddenly quite rambunctious. They were shouting and arguing. Dre would have been knocked over if he hadn't dodged an armored man that obviously wasn't going to adjust pace for the likes of him. The atmosphere changed from that of a group of soldiers about to venture into battle to something approaching a rowdy tavern moments before a brawl. It seemed incongruous to Dre, but maybe that was just how it was before a battle. He was disillusioned of his previous idea when he neared Adian and saw that he and his team were focused and serious, more so than he had seen them so far. Before he had walked the final steps between them, Dre had come to a conclusion. "What is in those red vials?" he asked, gesturing towards the near pandemonium behind him. An obvious flash of frustration crossed Adian's face as he waved Dre closer. He explained in a hushed voice that the vibrant red liquid was a common variation of a class of alchemical mixtures called war potions. This one in particular was a mild berserker potion. It supposedly turned people into better warriors, but it did so by reducing fear and inhibitions, stoking anger and dulling pain, not unlike the effect of alcohol on some men, but without the side effect of reduced coordination. Warriors affected by the stuff were violent and nearly fearless, but they still died just as easily as anyone else. Adian explained that his group didn't like the stuff, even if it was relatively short-lived. They would rather be in as much control of themselves as possible when they entered into the chaos of battle. Although, he did acknowledge that such potions did have their uses. They made sense in large-scale battles, desperate last stands, and as a way to put fire back into the bellies of exhausted soldiers. He argued that it definitely didn't make sense when heading into an unknown dungeon, where a quick wit and a level head were much more useful than battle lust. After the brief explanation, Adian paused, looked Dre in the eyes, and said, "This isn't going to be anything like you've dreamed about or imagined. Battles against men are bad enough. They are desperate and chaotic, but there is often at least a semblance of order. Tactics and positioning play a large role in those kinds of fights. Both sides value the lives of their own, and at least in some sense value the lives of their enemies. if much less so. Fighting a nest of monsters in their territory without a plan? That is chaos itself. Such monsters lack any sense of self-preservation. They will come from any and every direction, and at the moments when you least expect it. They won't form a nice line and charge. They will rush us whenever and however they can, dealing as much damage and causing as much pain as possible, not caring, not thinking, or even comprehending the consequences of their suicidal actions. It is terrifying. But it can be easier, in many ways, than battling against more intelligent opponents. If given time, the power of tactics and strategies can be made use of, and monsters have no way other than brute force to combat such cognitive weapons. Unfortunately, a dungeon bound changes all that. Monsters under the control of a dungeon are the worst of both scenarios. The power and viciousness of monsters is still prevalent, but they are controlled by an intelligent entity. The combination of individual ferocity and strategy has proven deadly to countless adventuring teams. He gestured all around, groups far better than us. By the time Adian had finished speaking, Dre's heart was racing, and his breaths were coming fast and shallow. The horrible realization of what he was about to do was truly dawning on him for the first time. He would have been grateful for the clarity if it hadn't come packaged with pure terror. He thought, longingly, of one of the red vials. Maybe he should take one. A little battle lust might be the only thing that could lure him into that cave now. Dre's mind raced, until a firm hand on his shoulder drew him out of his thoughts. He looked up at Adian and with a suddenly parched mouth croaked, "Why in damnation are we doing this? It sounds like a death sentence." Adian rubbed the back of his neck and gazed up into the sky questioningly for long moments before he returned his gaze to Dre. "I am not trying to scare you. I just need you to realize what we are getting ourselves into. Rucker thinks this is only a ratgore's nest, but I know that it's not. Wild ratgore don't act the way the ones we encountered did. They aren't organized. They don't retreat. However, if this is a dungeon, as I suspect and fear, we do still have a few advantages. I don't like Rucker or his self-serving morality, but he is usually a quite competent battle commander. He has powerful aura skills that automatically boost the baseline ability of the men under his command. It's one of the main reasons he was promoted. Besides that, this company is built of veterans and skilled warriors. This might be new to you, but it is not new for anyone else. Most importantly, this is a new dungeon. It has to be. Farmer Tillman noticed the rot in the forest less than a week ago, although, admittedly, he noticed that the forest wasn't acting like it was spring a little before that. Either way, the dungeon-bound can't have had much time to set up traps or to dominate many monsters. I fully expect us to win this battle. I just don't like how lightly Rucker is taking this confrontation, and I don't want you making the same mistake. Dre only nodded in response. The reassurances had done little to calm his roiling stomach. He feared that if he opened his mouth, more than just words would come out. Adian began to walk towards the dungeon entrance, but then he looked back, his previously morose expression transformed into a grin. I was going to wait to tell you this, but I talked with the team while you were asleep, selecting your class skills. When we get through this, they're going to leave the militia and join us. We are going to have a complete adventuring group, one ready to blaze a path of hope through this dark world. Dre didn't know how to respond at first. His body was a jumbled mess of emotions as newfound excitement warred against entrenched fear. The standstill couldn't last, though, and it wasn't long before a broad grin stretched across his own face. He had a class. He was part of an adventuring team. It was everything he ever wanted. No, it was far better than he had dared to dream since he was a child. He turned his attention outwards and saw his own jubilance reflected in their own way on the faces of Marcia, Gavin, Olive, and Miena. It felt good, oh so good, to belong. Dre's state of borderline euphoria slowly faded as everyone was assembled before the cave entrance. There were two groups, Adian and his team, and then Captain Rucker and everyone else. There had been no sign of ratgore since they had approached the cave, and its depths were so dark that nothing could be perceived within its gaping maw, which was why it hadn't been scouted. The only way to see without some sort of night vision, a skill that no one in the company possessed, was to use light. And Captain Rucker had been unwilling to risk drawing out the ratgore before they were fully prepared. With the company before the entrance and at the ready, the captain no longer had such qualms. He ordered the foremost soldiers to light torches, and a mage in Rucker's party cast what Dre judged to be a rather unimpressive light spell. That's when he noticed something strange, and the fear and unease that he had felt during his conversation with Adian began to trickle back in. The light didn't pierce the darkness of the cave the way it should. The darkness was thick, heavy, viscous. It had a tangibility that darkness wasn't supposed to have. It resisted the light, and in so doing it proved itself to be more than just the lack of luminosity. Surely he was just imagining it. His exhausted body and frayed nerves were playing tricks on him, right? He glanced around, but no one else appeared concerned at all with the odd darkness of the cave. Even Adian wasn't paying it any attention. Dre desperately tried to reason with himself that if something was wrong, then the veterans around him would surely have already noticed. His forced thoughts did nothing to slow his racing heart and heavy breathing. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the deep darkness. Sweat trickled down his brow. Adian's words reverberated through his mind. The combination of the individual ferocity and strategy has proven deadly to countless adventuring teams, groups far better than us. Dre was going to have to sit Adian down and have a talk with him about his pre-battle pep talks. The last thing he wanted to do was enter the cave before him. Running home and curling up in his bed seemed much more prudent. Dre was pulled from his thoughts by Captain Rucker's booming voice. "Remember, once we are inside, no noise until we engage the enemy, and that includes you, Bard." He took a moment to glare at Adian, his back turned to the cave, before continuing. "The Ratgor must be deep underground, potentially excavating an escape tunnel as Ratgor are prone to do, so we will have a chance to get the drop on them." He paused and met every individual's gaze. "Let's get in there, slaughter some Ratgor, and get out alive. Advance." Dre watched in growing terror as those in front of him were swallowed by the darkness. His joy of mere moments before was nothing but a distant memory. In an instant, he was alone outside the cave. He already couldn't see the light of the torches. He just stood there, his feet rooted to the ground. He allowed it for a moment, and then 2, and then 3. But they were long moments, the ones that stretched into eternity. Was this worth risking his life for? Did he really want an existence that was a series of terrifying encounters? A life that would more than likely end at the hands or claws or talons of some fearsome foe? He began to turn away from the cave mouth in what felt like slow motion. But then thoughts started to flash across his mind. He remembered the injured forms of the farmers lying bloody on his wooden cart. He thought of his parents and the kind of man they had raised him to be. He pictured the borderline manic grins of Adian and his team from only a few moments before. His thoughts converged onto Asya, when motion from the forest drew his attention. He imagined that he saw her duck behind a tree, but that was foolish. What wasn't foolish was contemplating the kind of man that Asya deserved, the kind of man that she believed he could become. But he was still frightened. Heroes weren't supposed to be frightened, were they? Great men and women filled myths and legends, but Dre couldn't remember a single story mentioning their quivering hearts or wobbly knees. Maybe, though, when they were on the first step of their journey, they had also been afraid. Maybe part of what made them great was that they didn't let the fear stop them. Maybe courage wasn't the lack of fear, but the mastery of it. And maybe, just maybe, today was as good a day as any to start making choices based on the man he wanted to become, instead of basing them on a fear of failure. So Dre turned back towards the cave. He walked up to the very edge of the shadow it cast towards the forest. He took a deep breath. Then he took a step. Then another, and another, and another. By his 12th step, he was entirely immersed in pitch-black darkness. He contemplated turning around. After his 13th step, going back was no longer an option. The middle of Dre's 13th step seemed to stretch for years and miles. A strange, uncomfortable pressure filled his body. He couldn't feel, he couldn't see, he couldn't breathe. For some unknown slice of eternity, he stayed like that, until finally he felt his right foot come in contact with something other than hard ground. Then, as if a spell had been lifted, the rest of his senses flooded back to him. Screams, growls, high-pitched squeaking, and the ringing notes of a violin echoed around him. The air felt thick and heavy. It tasted of iron and rot. The motion around him was too chaotic for him to decipher before his forward momentum pulled him into a 14th step. He nearly fell as something shifted beneath his planted right foot. He looked down and, to his horror, saw that it was supported precariously on a woman's bloody face. He stumbled, screamed, and then gawked at 3 lifeless human forms that were scattered across the rocky ground in front of him. They were surrounded by dozens of dead Ratgor, and even a large feline corpse lay among them, its head split down the middle. After a few long moments of morbid fascination, Dre was finally able to pull his attention away from the death directly in front of him and to his greater surroundings. He was standing at the edge of a large, rocky cavern filled with a sickly green light. The surviving members of the militia were clumped in the groups they had entered in, just beyond the corpses. They were entirely occupied with holding back the tide of corrupted flesh that was attempting to overwhelm them. They were fighting desperately, terribly, heroically. His focus was drawn to one particular figure when a furious war cry rose above the clamor of battle. He watched as Captain Rucker leapt forward and slashed horizontally with a cruel-looking sword that glowed a violent shade of orange. 5 creatures, all of whom should have been well out of range, fell to the ground shrieking as gaping wounds appeared out of nowhere, like ghastly smiles carved into their diseased hides. The men all around the captain hacked, slashed, clubbed, cast, and shot the creatures surrounding them with a reckless abandon. One man even shape-shifted into a black wolf and savaged the monsters with large canines. Everyone fought with rage, skill, or both. They cut down countless vermin, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. A dozen diseased leopards prowled the battlefield, lithe and deadly. Their speed was only outmatched by their elusiveness. A quarter as many corrupted bears were spread around the battle. They lacked grace in comparison, but more than made up for it with their massive size and prodigious strength. Between the larger beasts, hundreds of rat gore formed a writhing tide of fur, teeth, and claws. The disease seemed to affect all the creatures differently. Some had lost all of their fur. Others were covered in festering wounds, while still others had bulbous tumors of gray flesh clinging to their bodies. The only thing that they all had in common were eyes that glowed a bright emerald green. The rat gore charged the militia with less than no regard for their own lives. They provided a perfect distraction for the larger creatures. The bears lumbered around, their intimidating presence enough to shift the battlefield, since the humans were forced to always back away from them. The leopards instead stalked their targets. They were patient, only striking at opportune moments. As Dre watched, such a moment appeared. One of the captain's men stepped on a dead rat gore. It caused him to slip, only slightly, nothing dramatic. But it was enough. Out of nowhere, a leopard appeared, claws flashed, and blood sprayed. Dre, who had been frozen in awe, terror, and fascination, was startled into horrified motion by the gruesome death. He turned to run out of the cave, but only a towering wall of rock greeted him. He took a couple of steps back. Where was the cave mouth? Where was his path of escape? He searched frantically, but everywhere he looked was only stone. He began pressing at the wall, then prying, then scratching, scraping, punching, kicking. Eventually, the pain of raw hands and bruised knuckles brought him to a feeble stop. There had to be some mistake. It should be right there. Dre longed for a return to what now seemed like a comforting darkness, but regardless of how hard he wished, only an uneven rock wall stared back at him. "Boy, get your ass over here! We need potions!" Captain Rucker's scream drew Dre's attention back to the raging battle. The captain's face was deep red, and his expression was contorted in anger. Dre tried to move towards him, but his feet felt like they were coated in iron. He tried with all his might to force his foot to move even a hair's breadth, but he just couldn't make himself get any closer to the horrors in front of him. His breaths were shallow and quick. His heart was beating out of his chest. He couldn't do it. What was he even doing here? Why had he come? He wasn't a warrior or a hero. He didn't belong in this chaos. His mind once again started to enter a panicked spiral. But before he was consumed by it, a sound captured his focus. Music. It had been continuous since he had arrived, but only now did he notice how truly out of place it seemed. Dre turned and looked upon the source of the incongruity. Adian directed the battle like a composer conducted an orchestra. A violent, angry song poured out of his violin. It turned the chaotic actions of the humans into a deadly choreography. The frantic melody was embellished by the moments of pure musical chaos, where Adian played notes so rapidly that they were nearly indistinguishable. It was at these critical moments that the humans released their most potent attacks in the areas of most desperate need. Swordswoman Marcia was a blur, far too quick for her impressive size. Dre tried to track her progress from the glowing after-image left by her massive sword, but the easiest way for him to follow her movements was the trail of carnage left in her wake. Knight Gavin was an impenetrable wall. Every time a claw slipped through the defenses of a nearby ally, Gavin was there with a shield, sword, arm, or leg to stop the blow. He used any and every piece of his armored body to defend those around him. Rogue Miena was a wraith, a shadow, a silent carrier of death. She flitted around the battle, stepping in and out of the dark pools of shadow cast by friend or foe. Her twin knives weren't glowing. They were somehow doing the exact opposite. All the light in their vicinity grew dim, while all the shadows were transformed from weak and wavering to stark and deep. Ranger Olive was a messenger of death. He moved in flashes of speed, followed by moments of stillness. He would grab an arrow, place it on the string, draw it back in a fluid motion that was faster than the eye could follow. This was always followed with a single heartbeat of absolute stillness as he took aim, and his arrow became infused with light and energy. By the next heartbeat, the arrow was released, and inevitably found the vulnerability at which it had been directed. Adian's team, no, Dre's team, was fighting. They were doing well, but the enemies were unending. They needed help. His help. But how? He wasn't trained for this. He wasn't ready. His mind wouldn't let his body act. If only there was a way to just turn it off. The thought sparked a memory, and Dre came to an instantaneous decision. He reached his hand to the top opening of his pack, pulled out one of the berserker potions, uncorked it, and upended it into his mouth. In no time at all, his fear all but disappeared. Logically, the situation was no less terrifying, but now he didn't feel the terror. Instead, all other emotions were burned away as righteous fury blazed into the forefront. The audacity of these creatures! How dare they attack him and his comrades? They needed to be punished for their transgressions, and he, Dre the Pac-Man, would deliver that punishment. "Healing potion!" a voice screamed. It cut through the narcissism and spurred Dre into action. He ran towards Rucker and the bleeding man lying at his feet. While still on the move, he pulled one of the health potions from his pack and tossed it to the captain. Without stopping, he turned and rushed towards the sound of the violin. His team was fighting like a well-oiled machine. They methodically cut the Ratgor down. Adian was mostly behind the group, next to Olive, an energetic, epic song sprung from the strings of his violin. As Dre watched, a Ratgor forced its way past Gavin. Before anyone else had the chance to react, Adian sheared it in two with a quick slash of his violin bow. As riled up as he was, Dre still marveled that even though Adian had stopped playing for a moment, the song hadn't ended. If anything, the pause for Adian's attack added to the music. The momentary lack of melody only made its return all the more impactful. Before Dre managed to reach his team, he noticed that one of the corrupted bears was heading towards them. This one was nearly hairless, with green veins streaked across a body that rippled with muscle. Olive had obviously noticed as well, since he started shouting and his fire focused on the creature. But the arrows, even the obviously magically enhanced ones, barely seemed to slow it. That is when Dre realized that it was time for him to join the fray. He would show these monsters the cost of attacking his friends. He would crush the bear and turn the tides of battle. He reached into his pack and slowly pulled out a massive claymore. It was a beast of a weapon that one of Rucker's men had ultimately decided not to use, since it had been assumed that they would be fighting in much tighter confines in the massive chamber they currently occupied. Dre looked at the deadly weapon in his hands, smiled crookedly, then charged. His vision was edged in red as he ran past Adian and through a gap that Marcia and Gavin seemed to have created for him. Oddly, there were alarmed shouts from behind him, but he paid them no heed. Dre bowled over a Ratgor that got in his way. He felt a small prick of pain in his leg, but he ignored that as well. Then he was upon the massive creature. Dre leaped into the air, directly from his full sprint, and with a furious overhead swing that would surely enter the annals of legend, he brought the blade down onto the head of the charging bear. Dre exulted in the glory of his strike, so much so that he didn't notice that the angle of the blade wasn't quite right. Instead of splitting the bear in two, down the exact center as Dre had fully expected, the sword made contact with the flat of the blade onto the center of the beast's head. The blow was bone-rattling, and the recoil sent the sword flying from Dre's grasp. Fortunately, the power of the blow had done enough to knock the bear senseless. Unfortunately, the momentum that the large creature had built up in its charge could not be overcome by a singular blow. The bear's body flopped forward and landed on top of a confused Dre with a meaty thump.